Hey everyone, tonight we are going back. We have got a Saturday afternoon at the soda fountain in 1963, where the booth by the window was the most contested piece of real estate in the entire county, and the rules for who got to sit in it were entirely unwritten but perfectly understood. We have got the story of how one company, a family-run syrup operation out of the Midwest, quietly became the heartbeat of the American drugstore counter, and what happened to the man who built it when the world changed faster than he expected. We have got you behind the counter itself, in the white apron and the paper hat, learning the exact technique for building a chocolate phosphate so that it does not foam over the glass and embarrass you in front of the whole after-school crowd. And we have got a look at what the soda fountain actually was underneath its cheerful neon-lit surface, the economics of it, the social architecture of it, and the quiet reasons why it vanished so completely that most people under 50 have never once stood in front of one and ordered anything at all. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. It is a Saturday in the fall of 1963, and you are 14 years old and the week has finally released you. You know this feeling exactly. It is not the big relief of summer vacation, or the sharp, specific joy of a snow day. It is quieter than that. It is the feeling of a school week landing on Friday afternoon and dissolving into the specific freedom of Saturday, where nothing is scheduled, nothing is required, and the whole soft afternoon is sitting there waiting to be used. You have used a small portion of it doing nothing of consequence, and now you're doing what you have been planning to do since approximately Wednesday. You are going to the soda fountain. This is not a decision that requires much deliberation. It barely qualifies as a decision at all. It is more like a gravitational pull, the way water moves toward a drain, the way teenagers in 1963 moved toward the one place in any town where the adults were technically present but practically invisible, where your money was your own and your time was your own, and the particular social order of your particular school could be renegotiated over the course of a single afternoon if you played it right. You walk there. That is the first thing to understand. The soda fountain is not somewhere you drive to, not at 14, not in 1963. You walk, or you ride your bicycle, or you walk alongside someone who is riding their bicycle at a pace slow enough to match yours. The walk is part of it. The walk is when you figure out who else is going, what you are going to order when you get there, and whether there is anyone you're hoping to see who you are definitely not going to admit you are hoping to see. The drugstore is on Main Street, because in most American towns in 1963, the soda fountain is inside the drugstore, and the drugstore is on Main Street, and Main Street is exactly where you would expect it to be. The building has a certain smell that starts before you open the door, a particular mixture of things that includes the cool sharpness of whatever they mop the floor with, the sweet chemical warmth of the syrup dispensers, the faintly medicinal background note that comes from the prescription counter at the back, and something harder to name that is simply the smell of a place that has been open since 7 in the morning and has been quietly busy every minute since. You push open the glass door and the little bell above it announces you to no one in particular. The soda jerk behind the counter glances up and then goes back to what he is doing, which is pulling the chrome handle on the carbonated water dispenser, with the practiced ease of someone who has done it approximately 4,000 times and has developed strong opinions about the correct angle of pull. He is 17 or 18, maybe a little older. He wears a white apron and a paper hat that is either slightly too large or slightly too small, and either way it gives him the look of someone who has accepted a certain amount of indignity in exchange for a paycheck and the considerable social elevation of being the person who controls what goes in your glass. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. You scan the room before you commit to anything. This is not something you think about doing. It is simply what you do. Everyone does it. You read the room the way you read a hallway at school, quickly, automatically, cataloguing who is here and where they are sitting, and whether the particular social math of this afternoon works in your favour. The booths along the window are the prime real estate. Everyone knows this. The booths along the window have the natural light, the view of Main Street, and the slight elevation of visibility that comes with being seen from the sidewalk, which matters more than anyone at 14 will ever directly admit. 2 of those booths are occupied, one by a group of girls from your school, 3 of them, all wearing similar blouses with different coloured collars, arranged with the specific geometry that communicates which two of them are currently in closer alignment and which one is performing the good-natured tolerance of the slightly outer position. You know all three of them. You know the current geometry too. The other window booth holds a boy you vaguely recognise from your English class and someone you have never seen before, which is itself a kind of information, because in a town this size, an unfamiliar face in a booth has a story behind it. The counter stools are the alternative. 12 of them, chrome and red vinyl, swivelling on their bases with the smooth authority of things that were built to last and have. Most of them are empty at this particular moment of the afternoon. Sitting at the counter is a different social proposition from sitting in a booth. The booth is for groups, for conversations you intend to continue for a long time, for the careful management of shared space and shared secrets. The counter is more democratic. You sit at the counter when you are alone, or when you are with one other person, or when you want to be visible to the room in a different way, more present, less enclosed, available to conversation in a way the booth does not quite permit. You choose a stool near the middle of the counter, not at the end, not right in the thick of things, but the middle, which is where a sensible person sits when they want to reserve their options. The menu is on a board above the counter, written in letters that were probably chalk at some point, and have since been repainted so many times that the surface is not quite flat anymore. You do not need to read it. You have been reading this menu since you were old enough to climb onto one of these stools, and you know it the way you know the multiplication tables, automatically, without effort, available on demand. But you look at it anyway, because looking at the menu is part of the ritual. The way saying grace before a meal you're already planning to eat is part of the ritual. It is a moment of deliberation, or at least the performance of deliberation. What you will order has not actually been in doubt since Wednesday. You are going to order a chocolate ice cream soda, not a milkshake, not a sundae, not a banana split, which is an entirely different category of experience, requiring an entirely different kind of afternoon, and a companion willing to share the moral responsibility of the whole thing. An ice cream soda, specifically chocolate, specifically with 2 scoops, and you have a quiet but firm opinion about whether the cream goes in first or last that you arrived at through multiple Saturdays of empirical testing. You settle onto the stool and it gives slightly under your weight, the seat adjusting with the easy give of good upholstery that has seen a great many people and accommodated all of them. You put your elbows on the counter. The formica is cool and slightly smooth, wiped down recently enough that it still carries the faint smell of whatever they clean it with, something lemony and institutional that you would recognise anywhere. The soda jerk comes down the counter toward you with the unhurried movement of someone operating inside a familiar geography. He does not ask if you are ready. He just stops in front of you and waits, which is its own kind of asking. You order your chocolate ice cream soda. He nods, which is neither enthusiastic nor dismissive. It is simply the acknowledgement of a professional receiving instruction, and he turns back toward the equipment. Now you watch. This is also part of it. The equipment behind a soda fountain counter in 1963 is a landscape unto itself, a specific and beautifully functional collection of machines and dispensers and vessels that exists for one purpose, which is the construction of cold, sweet, carbonated things. There are the syrup pumps, each one a different colour handle for a different flavour, the chrome worn to a particular softness at the places where hands have gripped it daily for years. There is the carbonated water dispenser, which operates on a pressurized system that produces a specific sound, a short hiss and then a rush, that you have heard so many times it is encoded in your memory at a cellular level. There is the milkshake machine, a tall silver cylinder on a stand with a motor inside that turns a mixing rod at a speed that renders everything it touches uniformly smooth. There are the scoops, 3 of them, resting in a low container of water that is changed periodically and is currently somewhere in the middle of its useful life. There is the ice cream cabinet, low and horizontal, with a hinged lid that opens in 3 sections and releases a cold breath of air each time. You watch as the soda jerk builds your drink with the economy of motion that is the hallmark of someone who is good at a thing they do constantly. The chocolate syrup goes in first, a measured pump from the brown-handled dispenser, pooling at the bottom of the tall glass. The milk follows, a small pour from a steel pitcher, just enough to thin the syrup and coax it towards something drinkable. Then the carbonated water, and here is where the technique lives. because the water cannot simply be blasted in at full pressure, or the whole thing will foam over the rim and down the side of the glass and onto the counter, and everyone will know. It has to be introduced at an angle, the glass tilted slightly, the stream directed down the inside wall so that it meets the syrup-milk mixture gently, building carbonation without violence. You can tell he is good at this. The foam rises to just below the rim and holds there, trembling slightly with the energy of a million tiny bubbles in conversation with each other. Then the ice cream. 2 scoops as requested, each one lowered into the glass with a practiced wrist motion that places them just so, settled above the liquid but not submerged, so that they will slowly surrender to the cold and the carbonation over the course of the next 15 minutes, which is approximately how long a well-made ice cream soda takes to drink if you are approaching it with appropriate respect. He sets it in front of you. There is a straw, long and striped, and a long-handled spoon for the ice cream. There is a paper napkin that he has folded once and placed under the glass, which serves no practical purpose, but is a small courtesy that the culture has agreed upon and therefore carries weight. You pick up the straw first, because that is how you start. Not the spoon, not the glass held in both hands like a milkshake. The straw first, which allows you to draw up a little of the cold, dark, fizzing liquid from the bottom, where the syrup is still slightly concentrated, and that first pull is the exact thing you have been thinking about since Wednesday, and it is worth every minute. The booths along the window are full now. 2 more groups have arrived since you sat down, including 4 boys from the high school who you recognise but do not know well, who have taken the largest booth with the comfortable authority of people who have never once in their lives had to wonder whether that booth was available for them. They are loud without being disruptive, operating at the specific volume of young men who have found their people on a Saturday afternoon and are not bothering to moderate themselves for anyone. The soda jerk glances over at them without expression, the look of someone who has clocked their presence and made a quiet internal calculation about what they are likely to order and how long they will stay. The girl sitting 2 stools down from you, you notice now, is someone you sort of know from the neighbourhood. Not a close friend, not a stranger, one of the middle-distance acquaintances that populate the social map of being 14 in a mid-sized American town. She has a cherry Coke in front of her, and she's reading a paperback with the cover turned toward the counter, so you cannot see the title, which is itself a piece of information that you file without dwelling on it. She glances over. You both do the thing that people your age do in 1963, which is to acknowledge each other with a look that is neither a greeting nor an ignoring, something in the middle, a recognition of shared space that leaves all options open. Then you both go back to your own things. The afternoon has the quality of stretching. You have nowhere to be until dinner, which is at 6, which is 2.5 hours away, which is an enormous amount of time when you are 14, and the ice cream soda in front of you is still mostly present. The light through this window has that particular late afternoon gold that happens in October, low and long and warm in colour even when the air outside is already turning cool. Main Street is moving at its Saturday pace outside the glass, unhurried, the foot traffic of people who are running errands and have nowhere particular to be and are not rushing toward anything. You drink your soda slowly, not because you are being deliberate about it, but because the experience is not one you want to compress. This is not about nutrition. This is not about thirst, not exactly. It is about the particular pleasure of a place that belongs to you in a way that the rest of the week does not quite, where the particular social contract of school and home and all the requirements of both has been briefly suspended, and what remains is you, and a stool, and a chocolate ice cream soda that is reaching the perfect state of partial meltedness, where the ice cream and the soda are beginning to commingle into something thicker and richer than either one was alone. The soda jerk is making something complicated at the other end of the counter for the group of boys. He's doing several things at once with the ease of someone who stopped thinking consciously about the individual steps approximately 18 months ago. The milkshake machine is running. The syrup pumps are getting a workout. Someone has ordered something with whipped cream, and the pressurized canister is producing its characteristic sound, a short, controlled exhale, as he builds whatever architectural structure of sweetness they have requested. There is a particular hum to this place, not loud, not anything you would call music, but a sort of ambient texture made of the machine sounds and the low conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter from the window booth and the ever-present, soft crackle of the radio on the shelf behind the counter, tuned to something you can hear but cannot quite make out. the melody arriving in fragments between other sounds. You are not thinking about anything important, that is also part of it. The ice cream soda is 3/4 gone now, the ice cream mostly dissolved, the liquid sweet and thick and still faintly carbonated if you stir it with the long spoon, which you do, watching the little bubbles rise and pop at the surface. The girl 2 stools down has turned her paper back over, cover up now, apparently no longer concerned with concealing the title, which you can see is something from the library, a bright red cover with a typewritten author name that you do not recognise. More people your age have come in. The afternoon is doing what Saturday afternoons at the soda fountain always do, which is accumulating people who had the same idea and arrived at slightly different times, so that the room fills gradually and the noise level climbs by slow degrees without anyone noticing the moment when quiet became lively. The booths are full. Several people are standing near the door performing the particular theatrical patience of waiting for a seat, while watching those already seated with the quiet intensity of people who do not want to be obvious about it. You are in no hurry. This is known. This is understood. This is the social agreement of the soda fountain, which is that once you have your drink and your stool or your booth, you have earned your time there, and no one is going to rush you, not even implicitly, not even the soda jerk who has seen you take 40 minutes with a single ice cream soda on previous Saturdays and has made his peace with it. The last pull on the straw produces the specific sound that announces the end of a good thing, that soft rattling vacuum noise of a straw meeting the bottom of a nearly empty glass, a sound that is equal parts satisfying and slightly mournful. You set the glass down. The long spoon has a little chocolate residue on it. You put it on the paper napkin. You will sit here a little longer. There is nowhere to be until 6. The light through the window is still that particular gold. The radio is playing something you know. The room is full and warm and loud in exactly the right way, the specific friendly noise of a Saturday afternoon that has nowhere to go but further into itself. This is not a memory yet. It will be. But right now, it is just Saturday, and you are 14, and the week has released you, and this is exactly where you're supposed to be. It will keep being Saturday for a long time. That is the nature of these particular Saturdays. They repeat, accumulating into a kind of geography of the self, a map of the years between 12 and 17 that is plotted not by school years or seasons, but by stools and glasses and the specific social weather of a particular booth on a particular afternoon. The soda fountain is where you figure things out, not by talking about them, not by being serious, but by being present in a place where the ordinary transactions of sweetness and cold and carbonation create enough ambient comfort that the harder things become slightly more manageable. You will think about this place later, not with specific nostalgia at first, not the specific ache of something genuinely missed, but with the vaguer warmth of a background that is always there when you try to locate where you were when you were becoming who you were going to be. The soda fountain is part of that background, the red vinyl stool, the long spoon, the particular sound of that straw at the bottom of the glass. These things are in you, stored away with the unhurried patience of things that belong to a self still forming, waiting to be retrieved when the self is fully formed and looking back. The afternoon moves forward at its own pace. The gold light through the window shifts slightly, pulling toward evening without committing to it. The room goes through several cycles of filling and thinning as people arrive, stay their time, and leave. The soda jerk keeps working, pulling handles, scooping ice cream, dispensing syrup with the steady rhythm of someone who will do this same thing next Saturday and the Saturday after that, and thinks very little about it while he does it, which is not a failure of imagination but a form of competence. You leave eventually, not because you are ready to go, but because going is the next thing. You put your coins on the counter, the exact amount with the small additional amount that is the tip, the protocol for which you have learned by watching older people do it and have now adopted as your own. This soda jerk collects it without ceremony. You slide off the stool. The bell above the door announces your departure to the room. Outside, the air has done what October air does in the late afternoon. It has gotten decisively cooler, and the difference between the warmth of the room you just left and the air you're now standing in is the specific sensory punctuation that marks the end of a soda fountain afternoon. You pull your jacket a little tighter. Down Main Street, the lights in the storefronts are starting to come on. The first few of them, the pharmacy and the five and dime and the hardware store with its window full of rakes and implements that have taken on a seasonal relevance. The sidewalk has thinned out. The Saturday afternoon crowd has dispersed toward dinners and living rooms and the particular gravitational pull of Saturday evening. You walk home. The rules of the soda fountain are not written down anywhere. They never were. This is part of what makes them interesting to think about now, looking back, because the rules governed the afternoon with a precision and a consistency that a written code might envy, and yet no one sat down and composed them, or distributed them, or in any official way promulgated them. They emerged. They crystallized over years of Saturday afternoons and after-school hours, and the accumulated social pressure of several hundred teenagers working out the same set of questions in the same physical space with the same available materials, and what they crystallized into was a set of understandings so thorough and so natural that you absorbed them without noticing you were absorbing them. The way you absorbed the grammar of your own language long before anyone explained to you that grammar was a thing. The rules about seating were the most elaborate and the most consequential. The booths were for groups, the counter stools were for individuals or pairs. This was the basic framework, but within it there were calibrations of considerable subtlety. A group of 2 or 3 who chose a booth rather than the counter were making a statement about their intentions, which were to have a conversation that required some privacy and some duration, a conversation that a counter stool did not adequately support because the counter stool put you side by side with whoever you were talking to, which created a slightly lateral and somewhat public intimacy, whereas the booth put you face to face across a surface of approximately 32 inches of formica, which was exactly the distance required for a conversation of some weight. A single person at a counter stool was understood. You were there alone, you were drinking something, you were available to be spoken to without being required to engage, because the counter stool carried its own social protection in the form of the simple fact that you were sitting at a counter and not at a table, which in the American social grammar of the period conveyed a particular kind of transient purposefulness. You were not setting up camp. You were not demanding attention or company. You were there for the drink and the stool and whatever came of that, and if nothing came of it you would leave when the drink was finished, and no one would find that remarkable. 2 girls at a counter stool, however, occupied a slightly different social position from 2 girls in a booth. The counter implied either efficiency or availability, or a specific kind of casual sociability, and the nuance between these possibilities was read by the room with the automatic fluency of people who had been practicing this particular reading for several years. 2 girls at the counter, who were leaning close and talking in a lowered register, were having a private conversation in a public space, which was a specific social maneuver that the counter permitted, in a way the booth actually did not, because the booth enclosed you too thoroughly, made your conversation too clearly a conversation, whereas the counter gave you the cover of apparent casualness. 2 girls at the counter who were sitting upright and looking around the room between sips were doing something different, which everyone in the room understood perfectly, and which no one would have described in these terms out loud. The rules about who could sit next to whom were less codified and more situational, operating on the social map of each specific school, and therefore varying from town to town and year to year in ways that an outsider could not easily decode. The general principle was that the social distances observed at school were reproduced at the counter, with slightly more flexibility allowed because the fountain was a commercial establishment and not a school, and the claim of any particular group to any particular territory was therefore slightly less absolute. You could sit next to someone at the fountain whom you would never sit next to in the school cafeteria, and this would not constitute a violation of the social order, provided it was understood by both parties that the proximity was situational rather than declarative. The rules about ordering were simpler, but still carried weight. You ordered something when you sat down. You did not sit down and then spend 20 minutes deciding. The decision was made before you arrived, or at the very latest in the first 90 seconds of sitting, and you placed your order with the directness of someone who had given the matter appropriate prior consideration. Indecision at the counter was a form of taking up space at someone else's expense, specifically the soda jerk's expense, because the soda jerk's time was not infinite, and the indecisive customer occupied a stool and a portion of the jerk's attention without producing the transaction that justified both. You ordered the thing you always ordered, or you ordered something different with enough conviction that it was clear you had chosen to order something different, rather than simply failing to organize yourself sufficiently to order the thing you always ordered. The distinction was visible. The fountain was not a place for culinary exploration in the tentative, Perhaps I will try the peach this time, I am not sure. What do you think mode of experimentation? The fountain rewarded loyalty and directness and punished uncertainty with the particular social cost of appearing to not know your own mind, which at 14 was among the worst things you could appear to be. The rules about how long you stayed were the most interesting and the most invisibly enforced. You stayed as long as your drink lasted, broadly speaking, and then somewhat longer, and then until the natural end of the conversation you were having or the chapter of the afternoon that was playing out around you. The duration was self-organising. No one asked you to leave. The social pressure to vacate operated through the room, rather than through direct communication, through the presence of people waiting for seats, through the energy of the afternoon shifting as the later wave of arrivals changed the composition of the room. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. You felt it before you consciously registered it, and when you felt it, you began the process of finishing up, which had its own small rituals, the gathering of belongings, the checking of pockets, the placing of money on the counter in a way that completed the transaction and signalled the approaching end. Some people stayed too long. This was known and was discussed among peers with a mild irritation of people who had been waiting for a booth for 20 minutes, while the current occupants showed no signs of recognising the social obligation. The too long stay was not quite a violation of the rules, because the rules did not specify a maximum duration, but it was a failure of social awareness that was noted and remembered and influenced how the person who committed it was regarded in the future. Social capital at the fountain, as elsewhere, was accumulated by correct behaviour and eroded by incorrect behaviour, and too long staying was incorrect behaviour in a quiet key. The order in which things happened at the counter mattered too. You arrived, you found a seat, you ordered, the drink arrived, you drank it, you talked, the drink ended, you stayed a while, you left. This sequence was not ironclad, but it was the expected sequence, and deviations from it required justification that the deviator was expected to provide through their behaviour, rather than through explanation. Someone who arrived, found a seat, ordered nothing, and sat for 20 minutes talking to someone who had ordered something was occupying a slightly marginal position that required the seat holder's drink to be sufficiently long-lived and the conversation sufficiently absorbing to carry the justification. The soda jerk knew all of this. Donna knew all of this. Raymond knew all of this. The people who worked behind the counter were the most sophisticated readers of the room's social architecture, because they had watched the whole room from the outside of it for long enough to understand its patterns in a way that the participants, embedded in their own social positions and their own social anxieties, could not quite manage. The jerk saw the booth geometry clearly, saw who was in the outer position and what that meant, saw the two girls at the counter whose posture was of one variety versus the two girls whose posture was another. This knowledge was not something the jerk deployed in any manipulative way. It was simply the consequence of standing in one place and watching the same social ecosystem play out across many afternoons. You learned the ecosystem. You stopped judging it and simply read it, the way a naturalist eventually stops finding the behaviour of the animals interesting and starts finding the patterns interesting. The chocolate ice cream soda that you drank on your Saturday afternoon in October of 1963 was made of things that could be catalogued and described and measured: 2 scoops of vanilla ice cream, chocolate syrup from the pump, a small pour of milk, carbonated water introduced at the correct angle, a straw and a long spoon. The sum of these parts, however, was not the same as the thing itself, which is a statement that seems imprecise until you try to reproduce the experience and discover that the parts are reproducible and the thing is not. You can make the correct physical object, the same ingredients in the same proportions in the same kind of glass, and produce something that tastes right and looks right and qualifies in every technical sense as the same drink. But you cannot produce the Saturday afternoon in October. You cannot produce the specific social texture of the room around you, the sound of the radio too low to quite make out, the particular gold of the afternoon light through the window, the feeling of the week releasing you. Those things were the context in which the drink existed, and without the context the drink is just a drink, which is fine, which is good even, but is not the same thing as what you had when you were 14, and the week released you and the afternoon was long, and the ice cream soda in front of you was exactly what you'd been thinking about since Wednesday. This is the nature of the things we miss. Not the objects themselves, though we describe them in terms of objects because the objects are what we can name, and therefore what we reach for when we are trying to say something true. The thing we actually miss is the complete arrangement of which the object was part, the specific configuration of circumstances and relationships, and time of life and quality of light that surrounded it. The ice cream soda is retrievable, in some form. The Saturday afternoon in October of 1963 is not, and the ice cream soda in October of the present year is therefore not quite the same thing, is in fact a completely different thing that happens to contain the same flavours, and the flavours are good, and the experience is pleasant, but it is adjacent to the original rather than the thing itself. This does not make the original sad. Exactly. It makes it specific. Specificity is not the same as loss, though it sometimes wears the same expression. The Saturday afternoon happened. The ice cream soda was real. The stool swiveled on its chrome base with the smooth authority of something built to last. The afternoon belonged to you in the specific way that only that afternoon belonged to you, and whatever else is true, that belongs to you still, in the form of the memory, which is imperfect and partial, and subject to the same slow erosion that all memories undergo, but which is also genuinely yours, retrievable when you're lying quietly in the dark with the sounds of the present, fading and the past becoming more available, as it always does, in the particular quiet of a night that has decided to carry you backward for a while. The specific pleasure of a well-made cold drink is something that does not require analysis to be experienced, but benefits from it after the fact, because the analysis reveals something about why ordinary pleasures are not in fact ordinary. The cold itself has a quality that we rarely describe precisely because we rarely need to. We say cold, and the word carries its freight of sensation without asking anything more of us. But the cold of a glass of carbonated water and chocolate syrup and vanilla ice cream on a warm afternoon in October is a specific cold, not the blunt cold of something pulled straight from the freezer, not the mild cold of something that was once cold and is now losing the argument with the ambient temperature of the room. It is a working cold, a cold that is engaged in an active relationship with the warmth of the hand holding the glass, and the warmth of the room, and the warmth of the drink itself, as the ice cream melts at its own deliberate pace. The cold changes as you drink it. It is not the same at the bottom of the glass as it was at the top. This is also part of why you drink it slowly, or why the people who understand what they're doing drink it slowly, because the experience unfolds rather than simply existing, and rushing through and unfolding is a way of turning it into something else. The sweetness has this quality too. A chocolate ice cream soda is not uniformly sweet in the way that a glass of sugar water is uniformly sweet, dissolving into a single unchanging note that the palate processes and then stops noticing. The sweetness of the soda is layered. The chocolate syrup concentrated at the bottom has a bitterness underneath its sweetness that the milk dilutes into something more rounded. The carbonated water adds a sharpness that the sweetness of the ice cream as it melts then softens. The cream that forms as the ice cream dissolves carries a richness that changes the sweetness of whatever liquid it enters. You drink through a sequence of these small variations, and the sequence is part of the pleasure, a kind of narrative arc in a glass, the way a piece of music has a shape that cannot be collapsed into a single sustained note without becoming something entirely different. None of this was designed. The soda fountain jerk who learned to make an ice cream soda in the 1940s or 1950s was not thinking about flavour layering or sensory narrative. He was thinking about the ratio and the angle and the temperature of the glass and whether the ice cream was at the right consistency for the scoop. The complexity of the result was a consequence of the chemistry of the ingredients and the physics of their combination, operating independently of anyone's aesthetic intentions. The pleasure came from the materials being what they were, not from any deliberate artistry in their arrangement, and yet the result was, at its best, something that repaid attention with the generosity of something that was made with considerable care, even if the care was purely practical rather than aesthetic in its motivation. This is the paradox of the ordinary. The things we remember with the most warmth are frequently things that were produced without any particular intention of being memorable. The chocolate ice cream soda was not designed to lodge itself in the memory of everyone who drank it on a Saturday afternoon in October. It was designed to taste good and be sold for 15 or 20 cents, and provide a margin sufficient to keep the counter economically viable. The fact that it became, for the people who drank it, a kind of temporal anchor, a specific sensory marker of a particular time of life that could be accessed decades later through the smell of chocolate syrup, or the sound of carbonated water, or the specific visual of a red vinyl stool, was not anyone's marketing strategy. It was the unavoidable result of being young and being somewhere specific, and having the ordinary pleasures of that somewhere become the material from which memory eventually builds its archive. The next Saturday you do the same thing, and the Saturday after that, until the pattern is so deep it is simply part of what Saturdays are, and you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the particular squeak of the third step on the stairs at home, or the specific smell of your own kitchen on Sunday mornings. The familiar becomes invisible by becoming essential, and the soda fountain is essential in a way that is not dramatic and does not ask to be noticed. It is simply there, and you are simply in it, and the chocolate ice cream soda is simply the thing that sits in front of you while the world moves around you at its Saturday pace, and you are young, and the afternoon is long, and for right now, that is all it needs to be. The thing about the soda fountain is that it was never just about the soda. Everyone who ever sat on one of those red vinyl stools on a Saturday afternoon in 1963 understood this without ever saying it out loud, because the kind of understanding that lives in your body does not require articulation. The soda was real. The chocolate syrup and the cold carbonated water and the 2 scoops dissolving at their own pace, all of that was real and good and worth the walk down Main Street in October. But the soda was also a ticket to the booth or the stool or the afternoon itself, a small social contract in liquid form that granted you access to a particular kind of time that did not exist anywhere else in quite the same way. This is the thing about the decade. The 1960s were doing a great many dramatic things simultaneously, things that would fill history books and occupy scholars for the next 60 years, and all of that was true and important and happening. But it was also happening to teenagers who still needed somewhere to go on Saturday afternoons, somewhere that was not school and not home, and not the particular supervised spaces that adults designed for young people with improving intentions. The soda fountain was none of those things. It was a commercial establishment with a practical purpose and a labour force and a profit margin to maintain, and within those constraints, it was the closest thing a mid-sized American town had to offer a 14-year-old on a Saturday, who needed to be somewhere that was genuinely, quietly, uncomplicatedly theirs. You understood that even then, in the half-conscious way that you understood most things that mattered at 14. The booth by the window was not just a booth. The order you placed was not just a transaction. The afternoon was not just time passing. All of it was the rehearsal of something, the practice of being a person in the world, of occupying space and making choices and negotiating the social physics of a room full of people your own age, all doing the same thing in their own particular way. It was impermanent, of course. Everything is impermanent, but some things are impermanent faster than others, and the soda fountain was already in the early stages of the disappearance that would take another decade to complete. You did not know that then. Why would you? It was simply there, the way things that have always been there simply are, unquestioned and permanent in the specific way that only things on the verge of vanishing manage to appear, which is its own kind of lesson, though you would not understand it until the vanishing was complete and the lesson was all that remained. The history of the American soda fountain begins not with a teenager on a Saturday afternoon, but with a pharmacist, a pressurized cylinder, and a theory about health that was slightly wrong but commercially irresistible. The machinery came first, before the culture, before the chrome stools and the syrup pumps and the long-handled spoons. In the early decades of the 19th century, carbonated water was understood to be medicinal. This was not a fringe belief. It was the considered position of educated people who had observed that certain mineral springs produced water that fizzed naturally, and that people who drank this water sometimes reported feeling better. The logical extension of this observation in the minds of the period was that the fizzing itself was somehow therapeutic, that the carbonation carried health benefits that still water did not, and that a machine which could produce carbonated water on demand was therefore a machine with genuine medical applications. Pharmacies began installing marble-topped dispensing fountains in the 1830s and 1840s, serving carbonated water plain or mixed with various medicinal syrups that were meant to treat specific complaints. The syrups were not an afterthought, they were the point. Each one was formulated by the pharmacist himself or sourced from a manufacturer who made specific health claims on its behalf. There were syrups for digestion, for headaches, for general nervous exhaustion, which was a condition that the 19th century diagnosed with remarkable frequency and treated with considerable creative latitude. The fountain was a fixture of the drugstore because the drugstore was where sick people went, and carbonated water mixed with medicinal syrup was something a sick person could reasonably be expected to desire. What no one fully anticipated was that the carbonated water mixed with syrup also tasted very good, independently of whatever it did or did not accomplish for the nervous system, and that people who were not in any particular way unwell discovered they quite enjoyed standing at a marble counter and drinking something cold and sweet and fizzing. This discovery did not take long. By the 1870s, the soda fountain had become something distinct from the pharmacy itself, a social space embedded inside a commercial one, where the health claims were still being made because they helped justify the enterprise, but where the enterprise was increasingly about pleasure rather than medicine. The soda jerks, a term derived from the jerking motion required to operate the carbonated water dispensers of the period, were becoming a fixture of American commercial life. The good ones developed followings. People returned not just for their preferred syrup, but for the particular skill of a particular jerk who knew exactly how to build a drink to the customer's unstated specifications. It was into this world, already well established and already generating its own social customs and hierarchies, that the syrup manufacturers began to arrive in earnest. Charles Elmer Hyers understood something that most of his competitors did not, which was that the name of a thing mattered as much as the thing itself, and that a name which promised an experience rather than merely describing an ingredient was worth considerably more than any formula he could put in a bottle. Hyers Root Beer, which he introduced at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, was not the first carbonated beverage on the American market. It was not even the first root-flavoured one. What it was the first one with a coherent story behind it, a story about a healthful, temperance-friendly alternative to alcohol, at a moment when temperance was a genuine and powerful social movement in the United States. Hyers was a Quaker, which meant he had both personal and community-level reasons to promote the idea that a satisfying, sociable drink could be produced without alcohol. His root beer was positioned not merely as a tasty beverage, but as a virtuous one, and that combination of pleasure and moral acceptability gave it an advantage in the market that pure taste alone could not have produced. He sold the syrup in concentrated form, meant to be mixed with carbonated water at home or at the fountain, and he promoted it through advertising that was sophisticated for the period, emphasizing family use, health benefits, and the specific pleasure of something cold and sweet on a summer afternoon. His success prompted competitors, and competitors prompted more competitors, and within a generation the syrup market for soda fountains was a crowded and energetic commercial landscape where fortunes were being made and lost with a regularity that would have alarmed anyone paying close attention. Most of the companies that entered this market in the 1880s and 1890s are not remembered today. They produced their syrups, sold them to drugstores and purpose-built soda fountains, made money for a while, and then were absorbed or undercut or simply overtaken by the changing preferences of a customer base that was discovering new flavors and new combinations faster than any single manufacturer could anticipate. A few of them, however, built something more durable. The story of what happened in Atlanta in the year 1886 is one of the most retold stories in American commercial history, to the point where the details have acquired the slightly polished quality of things that have been handled many times. John Stith Pemberton, a pharmacist and patent medicine inventor, produced a caramel-coloured syrup in a three-legged brass kettle in his backyard on May 8th of that year. The syrup was mixed with water and taken to Jacob's Pharmacy, where it was sold at the soda fountain for 5 cents a glass. An assistant named Willis Venable, some accounts say it was Pemberton himself, mixed the syrup with carbonated water rather than still water, possibly by accident, and the result was the thing that would eventually become the most recognised commercial product in the history of human civilization. Pemberton called it Coca-Cola. He listed it as a brain tonic and intellectual beverage and claimed it cured headaches, relieved exhaustion, and soothed frayed nerves, because this was the language of the period, and a product without health claims was a product without a justified place at the druggist's counter. The cocaine in the coca leaves and the caffeine in the cola nuts contributed to whatever energizing effect users actually experienced. And this combination of real physiological effect with skillfully managed commercial narrative produced a drink that people return to with the consistency of people who have found something they cannot quite explain, but also cannot quite do without. Pemberton, however, was not a businessman in the manner required to build what his formula could potentially produce. He was ill in these years, struggling with a morphine dependency that had developed after a Civil War injury, and the complexity of scaling a commercial enterprise while managing the demands of his personal situation was more than he could organise. He sold portions of his interest in the formula to various parties over the next 2 years, ultimately selling the majority to Asa Griggs Candler, an Atlanta businessman with the organisational temperament and the commercial drive that Pemberton lacked. Pemberton died in August of 1888, in poverty, unaware of the scale of what he'd created. Candler understood distribution. Where Pemberton had thought in terms of individual sales at individual counters, Candler thought in terms of territory. He travelled, he negotiated contracts, he gave away free samples of the syrup with the aggressive confidence of someone who knew that the product would do the convincing if he could simply get it in front of people. He registered the trademark in 1893. He built a network of bottling partners that allowed Coca-Cola to reach places where there was no soda fountain counter within practical distance. He advertised constantly, with the understanding that in a market full of competing syrups, the one that held the most space in the public imagination would eventually hold the most space at the counter. By the turn of the century, Coca-Cola was available in every state in the Union. By 1910, it was available internationally. The soda fountain had created the conditions for its rise, had given it the infrastructure of distribution and the social architecture of consumption, but Coca-Cola had then done something to the soda fountain in return, had given the fountain a product so specifically and reliably itself that the fountain became, for millions of Americans, the place where you went to get a Coke, which was not quite the same thing as the place where you went to drink something cold and sweet. The syrup manufacturers of the period understood this dynamic very well and competed for fountain placement with the competitive urgency of people who knew that the counter space they won or lost would translate directly into the habits of the next generation. A child who drank a particular brand at the soda fountain would develop a preference for that brand that would persist for decades. This was not a theory. It was an observation, and it drove the marketing strategies of every significant soft drink company throughout the first half of the 20th century with a consistency that makes the competition between them look, in retrospect, less like a commercial rivalry and more like an extended argument about whose claim on American childhood was most legitimate. The soda fountain counters themselves were becoming more elaborate in these years. The simple marble tops and basic dispensers of the 1870s had given way to extraordinary structures of mahogany and onyx and mirrors and chrome, some of them as tall as the ceiling and as wide as a small room, fitted with gas lighting that became electric lighting as the century changed, designed to be impressive in a way that made the act of drinking something at the counter feel like a participation in something grander than a simple commercial transaction. The manufacturers of these fixtures, companies like the Liquid Carbonic Company and the Milwaukee firm of Brunswick Bolt Collender, competed on dimensions of beauty and engineering that seems almost comically excessive when you consider that the purpose of all this craftsmanship was to dispense flavoured water. But that misses the point. The point was never merely the flavoured water. The point was the experience of the counter, the theatre of the drink being made in front of you, the social permission to sit in a public commercial space and take your time without being required to buy anything beyond the glass in front of you. The soda fountain was doing something for American social life that American social life genuinely needed, which was providing a space that was neither fully public nor fully private, neither the formal sitting room nor the street, somewhere in between, accessible to a far wider range of people than the restaurant or the hotel lobby, governed by a code of behaviour that was understood by everyone and enforced by no one in particular. It flourished in this role for decades. The years between 1920 and 1950 were the golden era, the period when the soda fountain was at its most culturally central, most densely embedded in the daily life of American towns and cities, most taken for granted as a permanent feature of the commercial landscape. Every drugstore had one. Many five and dimes had them. Standalone ice cream parlours offered a version of the experience. Department store basements and mezzanines installed counters that served essentially the same function. The soda fountain was everywhere, which meant that the Saturday afternoon on the red vinyl stool was available to virtually every American teenager in virtually every American town, a shared experience so common it barely registered as an experience at all. It registered later, registered when the experience ended. The end came from several directions at once, which is how most ends come when the thing being ended has roots deep enough to require more than a single cause to dislodge. The rise of the drive-in restaurant in the 1950s gave teenagers a new social space that had the considerable advantage of including the automobile, which by that decade had become a social object of its own, a mobile room with the privacy of a booth and the freedom of no fixed address. The rise of the fast food restaurant in the late 1950s and early 1960s brought commercial food service down to a price point and a speed that the soda fountain, with its labour-intensive construction of individually made drinks, could not quite match. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. The rise of the supermarket, with its refrigerated cases full of bottled and canned soft drinks available for home consumption at prices that undercut the fountain price of a drink by a significant margin, changed the calculus of why a person would go somewhere to drink something cold when the same thing was available in the kitchen. The drugstores themselves were changing. The post-war expansion of the American retail landscape had produced chains, and chains were run on efficiency, and the soda fountain was not efficient. It required skilled labour in the form of trained soda jerks, dedicated equipment that needed maintenance, and a floor plan that sacrificed selling space to sitting space. The chains looked at their numbers and drew their conclusions, and the conclusions were almost always that the fountain cost more to operate than it produced in revenue when you factored in the opportunity cost of the floor space it occupied. By the early 1970s, the soda fountain had become a rarity rather than a given. By the 1980s, it was a nostalgic fixture rather than a going commercial concern, preserved in a small number of places that had understood early enough that the rarity itself was a form of value. Today, the counters that survive are almost entirely in the category of historical preservation, places that have decided the experience is worth maintaining as a kind of living museum exhibit, and they are not wrong, but the decision itself tells you something about the distance that has opened between the world that produced them and the world that now admires them. The formula that Pemberton cooked in a brass kettle in 1886 is still being sold, in quantities that would render all of his original production invisible by comparison, in every country on earth that sells commercial goods. The syrup found its way out of the fountain and into bottles and cans and eventually into a distribution network of such scale that the original context of the marble counter and the chrome dispenser and the soda jerk with the practiced wrist became simply the prehistory of something that eventually grew so large it forgot where it started. But the thing it grew into is not the thing it started as. The thing it started as was a specific experience in a specific place, available in real time to a specific person on a specific afternoon, and no distribution network, however global, has ever reproduced that. You can drink a Coca-Cola anywhere on Earth today. You cannot drink one the way you drank it in 1963, sitting on a red vinyl stool on a Saturday afternoon in October, watching the soda jerk tilt the glass at the right angle, waiting for that first pull on the straw, knowing that you have nowhere to be until 6. There is a detail about the soda fountain that historians of American business tend to mention and then move past without quite sitting with it, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The soda fountain was not the property of the teenagers who used it. It was never theirs in any legal or commercial sense. It was a commercial establishment with employees and overhead, and a margin to maintain, and it existed because it could be made to pay, and it stopped existing in most places when it could not be made to pay anymore. The fact that it was, for a generation of Americans, the primary social venue of their adolescence, the geography of their earliest independent social experiences, the place where they first practiced being people in the world without a parent nearby supervising the practice, none of that was the intention of the people who built and operated the counters. It was a consequence. A side effect of the commercial decision to put cold sweet things in front of people in a comfortable setting. The social meaning was entirely added by the people who used the space, not designed by the people who provided it. This is how the soda fountain became what it became, not by intention, by occupation. by the slow accumulation of Saturday afternoons in which teenagers arrived with their nickels and dimes and their need to be somewhere that was specifically theirs, and found that the available commercial space would, if they showed up in sufficient numbers with sufficient regularity, become exactly that. Which is itself a lesson that has nothing to do with soda, and everything to do with the way people have always found their own uses for the spaces that commerce provides. The booth by the window was a commercial asset to the owner of the drugstore. To the teenagers who sat in it, it was territory. The distinction between those two things is the whole story of what the soda fountain was and why, when it disappeared, it left a specific kind of absence that could not quite be filled by the drive-in, or the fast food restaurant, or any of the other commercial spaces that came after it. Those places were designed for teenagers from the beginning, designed with the demographics in mind, the parking lots and the loud music and the menu items priced for spending money rather than adult incomes. The soda fountain was not designed for teenagers. Teenagers simply decided it was theirs, and in that small act of informal appropriation, they created something that the spaces designed specifically for them have never quite managed to replicate. The spaces that are designed for you know they are designed for you. They announce it, they celebrate it, they are relentlessly responsive to your preferences in ways that the red vinyl stool and the marble counter never were. And that responsiveness, however well-intentioned, removes exactly the quality that made the booth by the window worth fighting over, which was that no one had decided it was yours. You decided that, together, on a Saturday afternoon in October, and that decision was the whole point. To understand what the soda fountain meant to American commercial culture in the first half of the 20th century, it helps to understand what it was competing with and what it was offering that the competition could not quite provide. The saloon was its primary antecedent and its primary competitor for the social function it ended up filling. The saloon, in the American city of the 1880s and 1890s, was not merely a place to drink alcohol. It was a social institution of considerable complexity, offering working-class men a warm space, cheap refreshment, a free lunch that was included with the purchase of a drink, the use of writing paper and a pen if you needed to compose a letter, access to newspapers, the companionship of other men who were doing the same thing, and the informal social services of the saloon keeper, who in many urban neighbourhoods functioned as an employment agency, a credit union, and a political broker simultaneously. The saloon was a male institution largely, and a working-class institution largely, and it was these two limitations that the soda fountain's early promoters understood as the gap in which the fountain could establish itself. The temperance movement understood the saloon's social role clearly and was explicit about the strategic dimension of the soda fountain. It was not enough to simply tell people not to drink. You had to offer them somewhere to go that served the same social function. The soda fountain, with its marble tops and its good lighting and its cold sweet drinks and its welcome to women and children and men who did not want to be in a saloon, was positioned explicitly as the temperance alternative, the public social space that did not require the consumption of alcohol to justify your presence. Hires Root Beer's early advertising material was dense with temperance language, invoking the healthfulness of the product and the wholesomeness of the setting in terms that made the moral dimension of the choice explicit without being hectoring about it. This worked. It worked not because Americans in large numbers were converted to temperance ideology, though some were, but because the soda fountain offered something genuinely desirable that the saloon did not, which was access to women as participants in the same social space. The soda fountain was, from its earliest iterations, a mixed-sex environment, and this was its most significant social innovation. In the American city of the 1880s, the places where unrelated men and women could occupy the same commercial space and interact casually were limited in number and constrained in character. The soda fountain expanded that number considerably. A woman could sit at a marble counter and order a phosphate without any implication about her character or her intentions. A young man and a young woman could share a counter without violating any significant social convention. This was not trivial. It was, in the context of the period, a modest social revolution conducted in an extremely pleasant setting. The drugstore itself gained from the arrangement. The soda fountain was a traffic generator bringing people into the store who then noticed the other things the store had to offer, the patent medicines and the toilet articles and the specialty goods that made up the bulk of a pharmacist's inventory and profit margin. The person who came in for a phosphate might leave with a bottle of face cream. The person who came in for a milkshake might notice a display of stomach remedies and remember that they had been meaning to try something for the digestion. The fountain served the rest of the store by putting people in a pleasant mood and keeping them in the building long enough to remember their other needs. This economic logic was well understood by the drugstore trade associations of the period, which published extensive guidance on the construction and management of soda fountains, the ideal dimensions of the counter, the correct ratio of stools to linear feet of counter space, the recommended equipment suppliers, the syrup brands that generated the highest repeat business, the pricing strategies that maximized volume without sacrificing margin. The advice was specific and often shrewd, reflecting an accumulated practical wisdom about what customers responded to and what they did not. The counter itself was the subject of enormous design attention in the period between 1880 and 1920, when the great American manufacturers of soda fountain equipment were competing for contracts with the intensity of people who understood that a fountain installation represented a significant capital expenditure and a long-term relationship. The soda fountain fixtures sold by firms like the Brunswick-bought Calendar Company, which had originally made billiard tables and bowling alleys before expanding into the soda fountain. Trade in the 1890s were not merely functional equipment, they were architectural statements, panelled in a elaborately carved wood or veined marble, or the onyx that was fashionable in the early decades of the century, fitted with etched glass mirrors and decorative tile, and the kind of beveled woodwork that communicated, unmistakably, that you had arrived somewhere that had taken its own appearance seriously. The message was intentional. The elaborate fixture said, "This is not a saloon." The saloon's aesthetic was dark wood and pressed tin, and the accumulated patina of many years of close human habitation. The soda fountain's aesthetic was light and marble and mirrors and the institutional cleanliness of a place that wanted to be associated with the pharmacy rather than the barroom. The fixtures were expensive precisely because the expense was visible. You could see the money in them, and seeing the money reassured you that the food and drink produced here were above the standards of the street. Hygiene was a genuine selling point in the period before widespread refrigeration, and food safety regulation made it safe to take the cleanliness of commercial food service more or less for granted. The early soda fountain operators understood that their customers were making a judgment about safety every time they ordered a drink, and that the visual cleanliness of the operation, the gleaming equipment, the starched aprons, the sparkling glasses, was part of the product being sold. Contaminated water had caused enough cholera and typhoid outbreaks in enough American cities in the late 19th century that the public had developed a reasonable sensitivity to the question of where their drinks came from and how carefully the production had been managed. The carbonation itself was a selling point in this context. The pressure required to produce carbonated water was understood to be a form of purification, the hiss of the gas escaping into the liquid signalling a kind of cleanliness that flat water could not claim. This was not entirely accurate as a matter of bacteriology, but it was widely believed, and the belief was commercially useful, and the fountain operators encouraged it through their emphasis on the visual drama of the carbonated water being dispensed, the pull of the chrome handle, the rush of the clear, sparkling water into the glass. The ice was a more complicated matter. Ice in the American commercial food service of the late 19th and early 20th centuries came from natural sources, cut from frozen ponds and rivers in the winter and stored in insulated ice houses for use through the warmer months. The cleanliness of this ice varied enormously depending on the source and the care taken in its handling, and contaminated ice was a documented contributor to the waterborne illness outbreaks that plagued American cities in the period. The soda fountain operators who used natural ice were therefore operating with an ingredient that carried genuine risk, and the ones who managed that risk most carefully and communicated that management most clearly to their customers built the most durable businesses. The transition to machine-made ice, which became practical and economically viable in the early 20th century as refrigeration technology improved and the cost of mechanical cooling equipment came down, was therefore a genuinely significant improvement in the hygiene of the soda fountain, even if it was sold primarily on the basis of convenience and reliability of supply rather than on the more urgent ground of safety. By the 1930s, machine ice was standard, and the concern about ice quality that had been a background anxiety of the fountain trade for decades faded into irrelevance. The ice well was now simply the ice well, cold and reliable, and not a source of any particular worry. The milkshake was a product whose history is tangled enough to constitute its own small historical argument. The term appears in American usage as early as 1885, in context suggesting a drink made with milk and flavouring and, often, eggs or alcohol, that bore limited resemblance to the cold, blended ice cream and milk drink that came to define the term by the 1920s. The electric blenders that made the modern milkshake possible appeared in the first decade of the 20th century, and the drink that could be produced with them, thick and cold and smooth, with the ice cream fully incorporated into the milk rather than floating in separate scoops, quickly became a staple of the fountain menu and a significant driver of the traffic that kept the counter economically viable during the years when the automobile was making it possible for Americans to travel farther for their pleasures. The banana split is generally attributed to David Strickler, a 23-year-old apprentice pharmacist in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, who's said to have assembled the first one in 1904 at the Tassel Pharmacy, where he worked the fountain counter. Whether this attribution is fully accurate is impossible now to verify with certainty, but the banana split's rapid spread through the soda fountain menus of the following decade suggests that whatever its precise origin, it met a genuine need that existing menu items had not quite satisfied. The banana split occupied a different social position from the milkshake or the ice cream soda. It was a production, a theatrical object, requiring a banana boat dish and multiple flavours of ice cream and multiple toppings in a specific arrangement, and its scale made it almost explicitly a shared experience. Too much for one person, just right for two people who decided to mark the afternoon as something worth celebrating. The sundae, later spelled Sunday by a spelling convention whose origin is itself disputed, addressed a specifically American problem, which was the blue law prohibition in many states against selling certain goods on Sundays. Ice cream sodas, in the jurisdictions where such laws applied, were classified as containing a stimulant in the form of the carbonated water and therefore fell under the prohibition. The sundae, which was ice cream with syrup and toppings but without carbonated water, was developed as a way to serve something desirable on Sunday without technically violating the restriction. Whether this legal reasoning would have withstood serious scrutiny is unclear, but the product it generated was sufficiently good that it survived into environments where the legal issue did not apply and has remained on fountain menus ever since. These are the small stories inside the larger story. The history of the soda fountain is full of them, moments of practical ingenuity and commercial opportunism and accidental invention that accumulated into a culture of such specificity and such richness that its disappearance left a residue of nostalgia disproportionate to the simplicity of what was actually being lost. What was actually being lost was ice cream in a glass with something fizzy. The proportional response to that loss makes sense only when you understand that the ice cream in the glass was never the point, that the point was the afternoon around it, and the afternoon was something that could not be packaged and sold separately from the institution that housed it. You arrive for your first shift at 6:45 in the morning, which is 15 minutes before you're technically required to be there, because your mother has made clear that being on time is not enough, and being early is barely enough, and the goal is to be so visibly present and so demonstrably ready when the shift begins that no one can have any possible criticism of your punctuality to bring to your manager. Your mother worked a counter job for 3 years before you were born. She has opinions about punctuality. The drugstore does not open until 8, but the fountain prep begins at 7, and the person responsible for fountain prep on weekday mornings is, as of this Monday, you. This was not how you imagined your summer job, not the frontier of your ambition, but it is a real job with a real paycheck which makes it, in the economy of being 16 in 1962, something you take seriously. You go around to the side entrance, the one that the staff uses, and knock, because the door is locked and you do not yet have a key, because the manager has explained that keys are issued after 30 days and 30 days of reliable performance, which is a sentence that contains enough implied threat to have lodged itself firmly in your memory. The person who lets you in is Donna, who is 23 and has been working the morning shift for 2 years and carries herself with the particular calm of someone who has made her peace with this particular version of her life. She looks at you, nods once in the way that experienced people nod at inexperienced people who have arrived on time, and leads you back through the storeroom to the area behind the counter. The fountain in the morning is different from the fountain in the afternoon. In the afternoon, it is a social space, humming and busy and full of the specific noise of people choosing to be in it. In the morning, before any of that begins, it is simply a workspace, a counter with equipment on it, chrome and glass and stainless steel and the particular quiet of machinery at rest. It smells different too. Not the warm, sweet smell of afternoon operations, but something cooler and more fundamental. The baseline smell of the place beneath the syrups and the carbonation, a faint trace of the cleaning product that went on the counter the night before, the cool indifference of refrigeration, the faint mineral quality of the water lines before the first draw of the day. Donna shows you the opening procedures. She does not explain them so much as demonstrate them, moving through the sequence with the brevity of someone who is doing this for roughly the 100th time and does not feel the need to editorialize. You watch and take mental notes and ask one question at a moment you judge to be appropriate, which turns out to be slightly later than the ideal moment, but not wrong enough to cause a problem. The syrup levels first. Each dispenser has a reservoir that needs to be checked and topped off before the morning crowd arrives, and the checking is not a matter of looking, it is a matter of knowing the dispensers well enough to estimate their capacity from the weight and the visual level indicator, and the experience of having done this enough times that your hands recognize what full feels like versus 3/4 full versus the quietly alarming lightness of a reservoir approaching empty. You do not yet have this knowledge. You have the visual indicator, which is a start. Donna checks the carbonation system. The soda fountain runs on pressurized carbon dioxide stored in cylinders in the back room, connected to the dispensers through a series of lines and regulators that you have been told about but not yet fully shown. The system requires pressure checks at the start of each shift. If the pressure is wrong, the carbonated water will be either flat, which is a failure, or overpressurized, which produces a different kind of failure involving foam and wet counter, and the specific social consequence of serving a customer a drink that is mostly air and very little substance. You check the ice. The ice machine is in the back and has been running since the previous evening's closing, and the bin should be full or nearly full, enough to handle a full morning shift without needing a refill. You scoop some into the ice well on the counter, which is a stainless steel insert that sits directly below the dispensers and keeps your glasses cold when the fountain is busy and you need everything to happen quickly. Then the glasses. The fountain uses several sizes, the tall ones for ice cream sodas and milkshakes, the medium ones for floats and phosphates, the smaller ones for plain sodas and cherry cokes, and the various simple mixed drinks that require no particular construction. The glasses live in a specific arrangement on the back counter, and that arrangement matters more than you might expect, because when the afternoon rush hits, and you have 5 people at the counter simultaneously, the difference between your glasses being exactly where you reach for them, and being 1 foot to the left of where you reach for them, is the difference between competence and a visible scramble that everyone at the counter will notice. Donna explains this last part. It is the first time she's explained anything rather than simply demonstrated it, which tells you that this is the thing she has seen new people get wrong most often, and that getting it wrong is the kind of thing that follows you through your first weeks here in a way that the other small errors do not. You arrange the glasses exactly as she shows you. You will re-examine this arrangement approximately 40 times over the next 2 weeks before it becomes something you do without looking. The store opens at 8. The first customers at the fountain are almost always the same type, which is not the teenagers who will fill the stools after 3 o'clock, but the adults who are on their way to work and want a quick cup of something and a moment of stillness before the day fully claims them. Some of them want coffee, which the fountain serves from a percolator behind the counter. Some of them want a quick phosphate, which is one of the simpler fountain constructions, syrup and carbonated water, no ice cream, no blending, no theatrical production, just the efficiency of 2 things mixed in the correct proportion and handed across the counter without unnecessary delay. Your first phosphate is fine, your second is also fine. By your 4th, you have found the rhythm of the syrup pump, which requires a firm and complete downward push to dispense the correct amount, not a tentative half push that gives you too little and forces a second pump that throws off the ratio. The ratio matters. The ratio is the reason people order the same thing every day and can tell when it is not right, even if they cannot identify what specifically is wrong. They just know it does not taste like it usually does, and they file that knowledge away in the place where customer loyalties are formed or eroded. By 9:30, the morning rush has passed and the fountain is in its quiet mid-morning phase, the window between the office workers and the lunchtime crowd, when the counter stools are mostly empty and the time belongs to whatever prep needs doing for the busier hours ahead. This is when you make the syrups. Not all of them. Not from scratch. Not the proprietary ones that come in from the syrup companies in sealed containers. But the house syrups, the ones that the drugstore makes itself, the simple syrups and the fruit concentrates that provide the flavouring for things like the cherry Coke and the vanilla cream soda that are on the menu but not supplied ready-made by any outside vendor. The cherry syrup is straightforward. Simple syrup, which is sugar dissolved in water at a specific ratio over low heat until the sugar is fully incorporated and the mixture is clear and slightly thick, combined with cherry flavouring concentrate from a bottle that has a smell so intensely, almost defiantly cherry, that it seems like a challenge to nature rather than an attempt at reproduction. You combine them in the correct proportion and taste the result, which Donna has told you is the only reliable quality check, and it is correct, which gives you a small and specific satisfaction. The vanilla is more complex. The vanilla cream that goes into the vanilla soda is made with real vanilla extract as well as the imitation kind, a house decision that the manager has made on the basis of flavour profile, and that constitutes what he apparently considers a competitive advantage, and you're not to discuss it with people who ask where the flavour comes from. You're to say it is a house recipe. This instruction has the slight gravity of a professional secret, and you receive it with the appropriate seriousness. The lunch hour is your first real test. The counter fills in a way that it has not yet done on your shift, not just the simple requests of the morning, but the full complexity of a fountain menu being worked simultaneously from multiple directions. 2 people ordering milkshakes while you're mid-construction on an ice cream soda, while someone at the far end of the counter wants to know if the pineapple topping is fresh or from a can, which is a question that contains a social dimension. You have to navigate carefully, because the pineapple topping is from a can, which is not something the customer asking this question wants to hear, and the answer that Donna has trained you to give is that it is a prepared topping which is both technically accurate and strategically vague. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. You learn things in the lunch hour that cannot be learned in any other way. You learn which drinks can be started and temporarily set aside while you work on something else, and which cannot, because the carbonation in a half-made soda will begin to dissipate if you leave it too long, and the whole thing will be flat by the time you get back to it. You learn the specific amount of physical space that each drink requires on the counter during construction, because the counter is not infinite and multiple simultaneous builds create a spatial management problem that requires planning rather than improvisation. You learn that the person at the far end of the counter who seems patient is not patient. They are simply quieter about their impatience than the person at the near end who has already said "excuse me" twice, and that attending only to the person who is loudest about their needs produces a specific kind of dissatisfaction in the quieter customers that expresses itself not in the moment, but in whether or not they come back. Donna watches, not constantly, not hovering, but present in the peripheral way of someone who is available if needed and aware without intrusion. Once, during the lunch rush, she steps in and handles a complicated milkshake order without comment, while you complete the ice cream soda that was occupying both your hands, and the coordination of it is seamless enough that the customer at the counter does not notice the division of labour, which is the intended outcome. You do not thank her at the moment. There is no time and no appropriate pause in which a thank you would fit. You keep working. She keeps working. The counter keeps demanding. This is how the shift works. Gratitude, like rest, exists outside the rhythm of service and is attended to when the rhythm allows. By mid-afternoon, you have been on your feet for 7 hours. The floor behind the counter is linoleum, which is a surface that was designed for easy cleaning and not for the extended standing of human beings who have not yet developed the calloused souls and the resigned posture that come with months of this kind of work. Your lower back is registering a complaint. Your feet have graduated from discomfort to something with more specific opinions about the situation. The particular shoes you chose for this job, chosen for their appearance rather than their support, are going to require a conversation with yourself that you will have after the shift, when you can be rational about it. The after-school crowd arrives at around 3:15, and the counter is full within 20 minutes. The red vinyl stools claiming the same teenagers who were here last Saturday and the Saturday before, settling into the same informal arrangements of proximity and hierarchy that define their days at school and that follow them here because hierarchy is not something you leave at the school door. You know some of them from your own class. They are here in their capacity as customers, and you are here in yours as the person who makes their drinks, and there is a brief moment of social renegotiation in the first minutes of their arrival as everyone involved adjusts to the new coordinates. You are not their classmate right now, you are behind the counter. This is a distinction that matters more than it might appear. The counter is a physical line as well as a social one. On their side of it, they are participants in the afternoon, civilians of the social landscape you all share at school, subject to the same unwritten rules of who sits where and who talks to whom, and what it means to be seen in the company of certain people. On your side of it, you're a different thing. You're the person who knows how to build the drink they have been thinking about since second period. You're the person with access to the machinery. You're the person who decides whether the scoop of ice cream is generous or merely adequate. This is not a power you will abuse, and you are a little surprised to discover that you have it, and a little more surprised to discover that they are aware of it. The chocolate ice cream soda takes 2 minutes and 45 seconds to build correctly when you're not rushed and the equipment is cooperating. You know this now the way you know things that live in your hands rather than your head. The angle of the glass, the timing of the carbonated water, the placement of the 2 scoops. You have done it enough times in 7 hours that the sequence has begun to belong to your body, which is the same thing that happened to Donna 2 years ago and will keep happening to you every shift until the job is finished or you are. You build the drink, you set it down, you say the price. The transaction is complete in its small and perfect way. The afternoon keeps going. The counter keeps filling and emptying and filling again. The syrup pumps get lighter as the afternoon progresses, which tells you that the popular flavours are moving through their reservoirs and will need checking before tomorrow's opening. The ice well needs refreshing twice. The milkshake machine runs almost continuously for a 40-minute period around 4 o'clock and develops a slight vibration that it did not have earlier, which you mentioned to Donna, who investigates and tightens something on the base of the motor with a small wrench she produces from a drawer under the counter, with the ease of someone who has done this before. The evening shift arrives at 5 to relieve you and Donna. The handoff is brief. The state of the equipment, the supply levels, the specific note about the milkshake machine. The incoming jerk is a boy named Raymond who is 19 and has been doing this for a year, and has the easy authority of someone who owns his corner of a small world and is comfortable with that ownership. He nods at your notes. He looks at the milkshake machine. He does not seem concerned. You take off the apron and fold it over the counter. You take off the paper hat. You look at your shoes. The conversation with yourself is going to happen sooner than you thought. Outside, the October air is doing the same thing it did the day you were on the stool rather than behind the counter. It has gotten cooler than the room you just left, and the transition is the same sensory punctuation. The cold air as a marker of the thing that just ended. Main Street is in its early evening configuration. The store's still open, but the foot traffic thinning toward dinner hour, the light going long and low over the storefronts. You walk home. Your feet are very clear in their opinions about this walk. You have learned approximately 40 things today, most of them in your hands rather than your head. You will be back on Wednesday, which is 2 days away, and by the 3rd week of this job, some of what you learned today will have stopped being learning and started being knowing, which is a different thing entirely and requires considerably less effort. You think about the soda you will drink on Saturday. Not because you have not had enough soda today. You've had more soda today than in any previous day of your life, but because drinking it on Saturday will be a different kind of drinking, on your side of the counter, with your own money, in your own time, with nowhere to be until 6. And that version of the thing, that particular combination of the sweet and cold and fizzing, and the afternoon belonging to no one but you, that is still exactly what it was. The knowing how it is made does not diminish it. If anything, the knowing makes the not doing it on Saturday a kind of rest that has a name now, a specific shape, a clear contrast with the work that earned it. Some things are better for understanding them. The odor on Saturday is one of those things. There is something specific about work that you do with your hands and your body in a space you learn to inhabit through repetition. It does not feel important while you're doing it. not in the way that you have been taught to think of important things. It is not building anything that will outlast the shift. It is not producing any artifact that will exist beyond the consumption of the things it produces. The ice cream soda you make at 4:15 on a Wednesday afternoon will be gone by 4:40 at the latest, the glass washed and rinsed and back in its arrangement on the back counter. The evidence of the whole construction vanished without trace. You made something, and it was consumed, and it is over. And yet something accumulates, not the individual drinks which are indeed gone, but the practice of them, the daily repetition of a sequence performed with increasing competence and decreasing effort, the calibration of hands that know the correct weight of a pump and the right angle of a glass and the particular sound that tells you the carbonation is at the right pressure before you have consciously processed the sound. This accumulates in your body the way all practiced things accumulate, becoming part of how you move through space, part of the physical vocabulary that will stay with you in some form long after this particular job has ended and the next thing has begun. The soda jerk was not a prestigious occupation. It was not designed to be. It was a service job in a commercial setting, paid at the lower end of the wage scale available to the demographic that typically held it, which was young people without professional credentials and with time to sell. The prestige of the position, such as it was, existed entirely within the social world of the fountain itself, where the jerk's competence and personality and willingness to engage with the customers who came back regularly created something that looked like status from the outside but was more accurately described as belonging. You belonged to the counter belonged to you. That was the transaction, and for the duration of the job it was worth something. The summer that you spend behind the counter will end. September will arrive, and with it the school year and the reduced hours that come with it, and eventually the job itself will end, either because you choose to move on or because the fountain closes, which happens to more soda fountains every year as the decade moves forward and the drugstore chains do their arithmetic about floor space and profit margins and arrive at their familiar conclusions. When it closes, the counter will be dismantled and the chrome dispensers will be removed, and the red vinyl stools will be sold or given away or simply disposed of in whatever manner is most practical. The space will become something else, a cosmetics department, a display case for vitamins, a checkout lane. The afternoon you spent on the other side of that counter, 14 years old and nowhere to be until 6, belongs to the same geography as the afternoon you spent behind it. They are part of the same place, seen from its two different sides, and together they constitute something that neither one alone quite adds up to. You know both sides of it now, the having of the ice cream soda and the making of it, the belonging to the afternoon and the serving of the afternoon, both of them real, both of them yours. By the third week of the job, you have stopped thinking about the sequence of steps in a milkshake. This is not something you decided. It simply happened, the way things move from conscious effort to physical knowing when you have done them enough times that the body takes over and the mind is released. You pull the handle on the milkshake machine without calculating the correct duration. Your hand stops at the right moment. The consistency is right. You pour it without measuring because the weight of the metal cup in your hand tells you when it is full enough and when it is not. This is the specific satisfaction of skilled manual work, and it is a satisfaction that the people who romanticize it from the outside tend to misrepresent, describing it in terms of craft or artistry that imply a kind of conscious aesthetic engagement that is not, in the actual experience, the primary thing. The primary thing is efficiency. The pleasure of doing something well is inseparable from the pleasure of doing it without friction, without the resistance of uncertainty or error, without the mental overhead of figuring out what comes next. The milkshake is right because your hands know it is right, and the satisfaction of that rightness is not different in kind from the satisfaction of any other physical competence. The way a carpenter feels the correct tightness of a joint before they see it, the way a baker feels when bread dough has reached the right consistency, the way any person who has learned to do a physical thing well recognizes the thing being right before they consciously process the recognition. The soda jerk was a skilled job in the way that most service jobs are skilled jobs, which is to say that the skill is invisible to the people being served and becomes visible only in its absence. When you do it right, no one comments. The drink arrives, it is correct. The person at the counter takes it and drinks it and pays for it and leaves, and no part of this transaction generates any remark about the quality of the execution. When you do it wrong, the comment is immediate, if not always direct. The flavour is off, the carbonation is flat, the ice cream has been scooped too small, or the syrup is too heavy, or the temperature of the glass is wrong because you did not chill it long enough. These things are noticed, they are mentioned, sometimes politely, sometimes not, and in either case they constitute feedback of the most direct kind, the kind that improves you in ways that explicit instruction does not quite manage. Donna gave very little explicit instruction. This was, in retrospect, a pedagogical decision rather than an indifference to your progress. The skills of the counter did not transmit efficiently through verbal explanation. They required demonstration, and then practice and then correction at the moment of error rather than before it, because the error was how you learned what the correct thing was. If she had told you the correct angle to introduce the carbonated water, before you had made the incorrect angle mistake and watched the foam overflow the glass, the information would have registered but not settled. The mistake settled it. The mistake gave the information somewhere to live. This is the pedagogy of skilled manual work, and it is ancient and it is efficient, and it has very little to do with how we tend to think about education, which is primarily verbal and primarily forward-looking, telling people things before they encounter the situations in which those things will matter. The counter taught backward, through consequence, and you learned the way the counter intended, which was fast and deep and through your hands. By the fourth week, you had opinions. Not about large things, not about your life or your future or the institution of the soda fountain, but about the small and specific things that are the province of anyone who has done a job long enough to have formed preferences. You had opinions about the correct ratio of syrup to carbonated water in a chocolate phosphate, which was slightly more concentrated than the recipe the manager had posted on the wall, and which you had arrived at through comparison of what you had made and what the customers had requested differently, and you made the drink your way rather than the recipe way without ever quite deciding to do so. The customers who ordered it regularly stopped commenting. The ones who used to say a little stronger, "Please stop saying that." This told you that you were right, which is the only evidence available in this particular domain. You had opinions about the temperature of the glasses. Cold glasses were standard, drawn from the ice well before use to chill the glass before the drink went in, on the theory that a cold glass maintained the temperature of the drink longer and improved the experience of the first sip. Standard practice was to chill for 30 seconds. You chilled for longer, closer to a full minute, because you had conducted the experiment informally, without stating to anyone that you were conducting it, and discovered that the extra 30 seconds produced a glass that was perceptibly colder, and that the people who received these drinks drank them more slowly, in a way that suggested enjoyment rather than urgency, which implied that the extra 30 seconds was doing something. You had opinions about whipped cream. The pressurized canister was fast and the result was consistent, which were both genuine advantages when the counter was busy and the people waiting for their drinks were exhibiting the particular impatience of people who have been patient for long enough. But whipped cream from the canister collapsed faster than cream whipped by hand, losing its structure in the heat of the room within a few minutes of application, which meant that the sundae you delivered to the person at the counter looked correct at the moment of delivery, but would look deflated by the time they were halfway through it, if they were eating slowly. You mentioned this to Donna. She looked at the canister and then at you for a moment. Then she said that the canister was faster, which it was. You let it go. The regulars were the best part of the job. Not the Saturday teenagers, who were regulars in the sense of appearing every week, but the daily regulars. The small set of people who came in almost every weekday morning or afternoon, who ordered the same thing with enough consistency that you knew their order before they sat down, who constituted a kind of accountability that the weekly visitors did not provide. If you made the regular's cherry coke incorrectly, the regular noticed. If you made it correctly, the regular did not comment, but they came back the next day, which was the comment. There was a woman named Mrs. Hartwell who came in every Tuesday and Thursday at 2:15 and ordered a vanilla ice cream soda and sat at the third stool from the left for exactly 40 minutes before leaving. She was in her late 60s, white-haired, soft-spoken, and she brought a paperback or a magazine and she read while she drank her soda, and she tipped exactly 10 cents every visit, regardless of the quality of the service or the speed of the delivery, which was consistent enough that you stopped wondering about it and simply accepted it as a feature of the Tuesday and Thursday landscape. She said good afternoon when she arrived and thank you when she left, and almost nothing in between unless you asked her something, which you occasionally did. Not because you were required to, but because 40 minutes of someone sitting quietly at your counter constitutes a kind of ongoing presence that eventually invites a word. She had, it turned out, been coming to this particular counter for close to 20 years, since before the current management, since before the previous management, since the counter was owned by someone whose name she mentioned but that you did not recognise. She had been drinking the vanilla ice cream soda at the third stool from the left on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 20 years, which was a kind of devotion so specific and so quiet that it registered differently once you knew it than it had when she was simply a regular who tipped 10 cents. You wondered what the counter was for her in those 20 years. Not the drink, though she clearly liked the drink, but the Tuesday and Thursday ritual of sitting in a particular place at a particular time and being handed something cold and sweet and correct, the specific quality of that particular hour being her own, in the way that whatever surrounded it was perhaps not quite entirely her own. You did not ask. Some things are obvious enough that asking would be a reduction, rather than an expansion. You made the vanilla ice cream soda correctly, with the extra 30 seconds of glass chilling and the careful angle of the carbonated water, and you set it in front of her, and she said thank you, and she opened her book. This is also what the counter was. Not only the Saturday afternoons of teenagers negotiating social space, but the Tuesday afternoons of women who had found, in 40 minutes and a vanilla ice cream soda, and the third stool from the left, something that was specifically and reliably and quietly theirs. The counter served the room in all its configurations, and the skill of the person behind it was in part the skill of reading those configurations and responding to each one with what it actually needed, which was not always the same thing and was not always the drink. The equipment aged alongside you. This is something you noticed without paying explicit attention to it. The slow accumulation of minor imperfections in the machinery that meant the machinery had been operating for a long time and intended to continue operating for a long time, and was doing both with the slightly worn dignity of something that was not new but was still entirely functional. The milkshake machine's vibration that Raymond tightened became, by October, a slightly different vibration in a slightly different location, one that the manager addressed with a phone call to the service representative rather than with the wrench, and that was resolved by a part replacement that took 2 hours and produced a machine that was briefly, temporarily new-sounding, before settling back into the older register of something that has been running a long time and knows it. The carbonation system was periodically adjusted by a technician who arrived with tools and a practiced manner, and whose adjustments produced, for a day or two afterward, a carbonated water that was slightly different from the usual, slightly sharper or slightly softer, in ways that only the jerk and the most attentive regulars noticed, and that settled back toward the familiar register within a few shifts. The ice cream cabinet's insulation was not perfect, and in the warmth of the afternoon rush the temperature inside it rose slightly, which meant that the ice cream in the less insulated corners was at a slightly different consistency than the ice cream in the centre, and this affected the scoop, and the effect on the scoop was something you learned to compensate for without being aware that you had learned it. All of this is what the job was. The drink was the formal transaction, the thing with a name and a price and a customer attached to it. But the job was everything around the drink. The knowing of the equipment and its habits and its moods, the reading of the room and its requirements, the maintenance of the counter as a space that felt continuous and reliable and worth returning to. The soda jerk was the counter's caretaker in a way that the word jerk, with its slightly undignified connotation of pulling handles and scooping things, did not quite capture. You kept the space working, you kept the experience available. That was the job, and you were doing it. The official image of the American soda fountain is almost painfully cheerful. It exists in the cultural record in full saturated colour, because it was the 1950s that burnished the image most thoroughly, and the 1950s had a particular gift for saturating its own representations. The counter gleams. The stools glow with a red so pure it seems to have been invented for the purpose. The soda jerk is young and smiling and moving, with an energy that suggests he is genuinely delighted by his work. The teenagers at the counter are every variety of wholesome, leaning toward each other with the bright-eyed animation of people who have never once had a complicated feeling. The ice cream sodas are perfect. The milkshakes are enormous. The cherry on top of the sundae is exactly centered. This image is not entirely false. The soda fountain was genuinely a pleasant place. The drinks were genuinely good. Many of the people who worked behind the counter were genuinely competent and sometimes genuinely happy to be there. Some of the teenagers who sat on the stools were genuinely uncomplicated at that particular moment. The image captures something real. But the image also omits a very great deal, and what it omits is not incidental to understanding what the soda fountain actually was. It is essential to it. Start with the labour. The cheerful soda jerk of the official image is not paid well. He was never paid well. The wages for fountain work were among the lower wages available in the American retail economy throughout the soda fountain's entire operational lifespan. In the 1940s and 1950s, a skilled soda jerk might earn between 30 and 50 cents an hour, depending on the establishment and the region, which placed the work well within the category of jobs that young people took because they were available and that adults moved away from as soon as something better offered itself. The tips helped. Good tips helped significantly. But the tip economy of the soda fountain was, like all tip economies, unpredictable and unevenly distributed, concentrating reward on the most visible and socially appealing workers, while leaving others in the same shop earning considerably less for the same labour. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. The training was informal and largely uncompensated. The skills required to work a busy soda fountain competently, the physical dexterity, the recipe knowledge, the equipment management, the customer handling, were not recognised in any formal credentialing system and did not transfer to any other job category in ways that were legible to employers. You could be a genuinely excellent soda jerk for 3 years, building the institutional knowledge of your particular counter with the dedication and consistency of a craftsperson, and this expertise would not appear anywhere on any document that your next employer could read or evaluate. It simply dissolved when you left. The hours were long when the counter was busy and unprofitably short when it was not. The soda fountain business was deeply seasonal, heavily concentrated in the warm months when ice cream and cold drinks were most in demand, and many fountain workers experienced a winter reduction in hours that required them to find supplementary income, which they negotiated as best they could within the limited options available to people without professional credentials. The irregular schedule of the retail service industry, which has not improved in the decades since, was already a feature rather than a bug of this work in the 1950s and 60s. You showed up when they needed you. When they did not need you, you were not compensated for the readiness. Now look at who was doing this work and who was not. The image of the soda jerk is almost invariably a white young man. This is historically accurate in a narrow sense, in that white young men did indeed work soda fountain counters in large numbers across the country throughout the mid-century period. But it is historically incomplete in a much larger sense, because the soda fountain operated within a racial geography that the official image consistently and deliberately omitted. In the segregated South, and in much of the segregated North as well, the soda fountain counter was a racially restricted space. Black Americans were not welcome at the counter. In some establishments, they were served from a side window or a separate takeout station. In many others, they were not served at all. The beautiful chrome counters and the red vinyl stools and the long-handled spoons and the ice cream sodas with their 2 scoops were, for a substantial portion of the American population, not accessible in the casual social way that the official image presented as universal. This was not incidental. It was structural. The soda fountain's role as a social gathering place for teenagers depended on a set of assumptions about which teenagers were permitted to gather there. The Saturday afternoon experience, the red vinyl stool, the chocolate ice cream soda, the booth by the window with its contested social meaning, these things existed inside a system that was explicitly organised to exclude some people from participating. The teenagers who were excluded from the counter on racial grounds did not get to have that Saturday afternoon. They did not get to claim the booth by the window, or develop loyalty to a particular flavour, or practice the social rituals that the counter made possible. They were outside the experience looking in, and the official image of the soda fountain never once turned to acknowledge them. The lunch counter sit-ins that began in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960, were not incidental to the history of the soda fountain. They were a direct confrontation with the racial exclusion that the counter had enforced since its earliest days. 4 black college students, as L. Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil sat down at the Woolworths lunch counter and asked to be served. They were not served, and they did not leave. Over the following days, their numbers grew. The sit-ins spread to other cities, other counters, other states. The image of the civil rights movement's lunch counter campaign looks, in the historical record, like a direct refusal to accept what the official image of the counter had always presented as natural. The Woolworths counter in Greensboro served coffee and sandwiches, and the simple short-order food of a 5-and-dime lunch counter, rather than the ice cream sodas of a drugstore fountain, but the architecture was the same. The chrome, the stools, the counter separating the workers from the customers, the simple transaction of something edible or drinkable exchanged for money. The refusal to complete that transaction on racial grounds was what the sit-in protesters made visible, not by pointing at it and explaining it, but by sitting down and demanding to be part of it, and remaining seated when the demand was denied. By 1963, the year of your Saturday afternoon, some of those counters had been desegregated, others had not. The geography of who could sit on the red vinyl stool and order a chocolate ice cream soda was still uneven in ways that the official image of the soda fountain had never bothered to map. The warmth of the place, the specific pleasure of the afternoon, the social belonging that the counter provided, these things were genuinely available to some Americans and genuinely unavailable to others, and the difference was not about preference or choice. It was about a system of exclusion that the cheerful photographic record of the soda fountain's golden age chose consistently not to show. There is another omission in the official image, less politically urgent but worth noting, which is the considerable anxiety that the soda fountain generated in certain quarters about exactly the social function that we have been celebrating. The idea that teenagers were gathering in a commercial space with minimal adult supervision, spending money in small quantities, and stretching that money into several hours of social time was not uniformly welcomed. Youth reformers of the 1930s and 40s worried that the soda fountain provided an environment in which young people, particularly young women, could meet young men without the formal oversight that previous generations would have considered appropriate. The fountain was accused, in various iterations of this concern, of being a venue for casual social mixing that loosened the appropriate supervision of female behaviour. This concern carried a specific class dimension. Middle-class and upper-middle-class families were more likely to have their own domestic spaces for supervised socialising, parlours and family rooms, and organised social events at church or at school. The soda fountain served disproportionately teenagers from working-class and lower-middle-class backgrounds for whom the alternative social venues were fewer and more restricted. The anxiety about the fountain was therefore also, though this was rarely stated explicitly, an anxiety about those teenagers gathering freely in spaces where their betters were not present to observe and shape the interactions. The fountain industry was aware of this anxiety and addressed it, where it could by maintaining a visible cleanliness and order that signalled respectability. The white aprons and paper hats of the soda jerks were not merely functional, they signalled a kind of structured environment, supervised and organised, a professional operation rather than a hangout. The matching colours and consistent design of the major fountain equipment suppliers served the same function. If the fountain looked like a well-organised commercial establishment, the argument went, the activities that took place in it would be correspondingly orderly. Whether the activities were correspondingly orderly depended very much on which fountain you were visiting and which afternoon you chose. The corner drugstore fountain on a Tuesday with 4 elderly customers and a quiet soda jerk was a different environment from the large recreational fountain on a Friday evening with 40 teenagers packed into every available seat, and the noise level approaching something that would alarm a parent who happened to walk past. The official image averaged these experiences into a composite of cheerful respectability. The reality was more variable and more interesting, and considerably more human than the average. The syrups themselves had a history that the bright label and the familiar taste worked hard to obscure. Coca-Cola, in the form available at the soda fountain in 1963, had been altered from its original formula in ways that the company preferred not to discuss in detail. The coca leaf extract from which the name derived had been decocainised since 1903, when the combined pressures of progressive-era drug reform and the specific racial anxieties of the Jim Crow South, where the idea of cocaine-containing beverages being sold to black men was being actively weaponized in the temperance press, made the ingredient a commercial liability that no amount of branding could neutralise. The formulation that remained was not the one that Pemberton had originally sold. It was a product with the same name and a similar taste, and a completely different pharmacological profile, and the marketing had never found it necessary to explain this distinction to the customers who ordered it at the counter. This was not unusual. Most of the patent medicine heritage of the early soda fountain syrups had been quietly revised or abandoned as federal regulation of food and drug ingredients tightened through the early 20th century. The health claims that had justified the fountain's original existence in the drugstore context had been stripped away or softened into vague suggestions that fell short of the specificity required by law. What remained was the flavour and the habit, the loyalty of customers who associated the taste with a particular pleasure that existed independent of any therapeutic purpose. The fountain survived the loss of its medical rationale because the social rationale had always been stronger. People did not go to the soda fountain because they believed carbonated water would cure their headaches. They went because it was a pleasant place to be, and the drink was the admission ticket, and the real product was the afternoon. The pharmaceutical origins were an interesting detail in the backstory of a thing that had long since transcended its origins. And then there is the economics of the ice cream soda itself, which is less romantic than the experience of drinking it, but illuminates the whole enterprise in a way that the romantic version does not quite manage. The raw materials of an ice cream soda, 2 scoops of ice cream, a measure of chocolate syrup, a small amount of milk and carbonated water, cost the drugstore somewhere between 3 and 7 cents in the early 1960s, depending on the price of dairy and the current cost of the syrup contract. The fountain sold the finished drink for between 15 and 30 cents, depending on the establishment's position in the market. This margin was what kept the fountain economically viable in theory. In practice, the margin was narrowed by labour, by equipment maintenance, by the overhead of the physical space, and by the chronic inefficiency of a service format that required a skilled worker to spend 2 to 3 minutes making each individual drink when that worker's time could alternatively be spent on tasks with a better return per minute. The soda fountain's economics were always precarious. They depended on volume during the peak hours of the day to compensate for the slow hours when the counter sat empty and the staff still needed to be paid. They depended on the loyalty of a customer base that was, by definition, young, and therefore churning constantly as one cohort of teenagers aged out of the counterculture and was replaced by a slightly younger one whose tastes and habits were not guaranteed to replicate their predecessors. They depended on a competitive landscape that remained favourable, meaning on the absence of a lower-priced, faster, more convenient alternative that would draw the customer base away before they could be converted into adults who brought their own children back to the counter on Saturday afternoons. That favourable landscape ended in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and it ended all at once from multiple directions in a way that left the fountain industry very little room to adapt. The drugstore chains and supermarkets that replaced the independent pharmacies did their numbers and found the fountain wanting. The fast food chains were doing the same thing the fountain did, providing food and drink and social space, but faster, cheaper, and with the added enticement of the parking lot and the drive-through window that the automobile culture of the post-war years had established as preferred features of any commercial food service operation. The generation of Americans who grew up at the soda fountain in the 1940s and 1950s watched it disappear in the 1960s and 1970s with the specific grief of people who have lost something that they had not realised was fragile because it had always simply been there. The Saturday afternoon on the red vinyl stool seemed permanent. So do most things from the inside. It is only from the outside, looking back, that the precariousness of the whole arrangement becomes visible, the way the economic logic that sustained it was always conditional, always dependent on a particular configuration of the market that would not hold indefinitely. The fountain did not fail because the teenagers stopped enjoying it. They did not. The teenagers who spent their Saturday afternoons at the counter in 1963 enjoyed those afternoons as much as any generation before them. The fountain failed because the system that made it possible to exist, the drugstore as neighbourhood institution, the absence of competing commercial spaces designed specifically for teenage social life, the economics of a labour market where skilled counterwork could be had for 35 cents an hour, all of that shifted simultaneously in a direction that the fountain could not follow. What remained, after the counter was removed and the space was repurposed, was the memory of a Saturday afternoon in October, a chocolate ice cream soda at the right stage of meltedness, a stool that swiveled on its chrome base with the smooth authority of something built to last, and the specific gold of the late afternoon light through a window on Main Street, in a town where the things you took for granted were, as always, in the process of becoming the things you would miss. The question of who the soda fountain was designed for has a clear answer and an incomplete one. The clear answer is that it was designed for paying customers, the people who would exchange money for the things the fountain produced, and who would do so with sufficient frequency to justify the capital investment in the equipment and the ongoing cost of the labour and the inventory. This is a commercial establishment's answer, accurate as far as it goes, and it goes considerably less far than the question requires. The incomplete answer begins with the observation that not all paying customers were equally welcome. The soda fountain operated within a social geography that it did not create and did not challenge, a geography organised along lines of race and gender and class that shaped the experience of every person who either entered or was prevented from entering. Understanding the soda fountain fully requires holding both things at once, the genuine pleasure of the experience and the exclusions that circumscribed who was permitted to have it. Gender was the dimension the fountain most explicitly addressed, and addressed well enough that the woman at the counter in 1935 was not remarkable in the way she might have been in the same commercial space a generation earlier. The soda fountain had from its earliest days positioned itself as appropriate for women, and this positioning had become a reality through the sheer accumulation of women sitting at counters and ordering drinks and returning the following week to do it again. By the mid-20th century, the soda fountain was, in many respects, as much a female social space as a male one, and the teenage girls who occupied the booths on Saturday afternoons were exercising a social freedom that their grandmothers had not possessed in quite the same form. This was genuine progress. It was also partial. The freedom to sit at a commercial counter and order a milkshake was a small freedom, and it existed within a larger set of constraints on women's social and economic participation that the milkshake did nothing to change. The women who worked behind the counter as waitresses in the fountain establishments that employed them earned wages well below those of men in comparable positions, worked under conditions that included the management of customer behaviour that frequently required the exercise of patience with conduct that would not be tolerated in a professional setting, and operated within employment arrangements that offered very little security or advancement. The freedom to be a customer at the counter was not the same as the freedom to be fully and equitably incorporated into the economy that the counter represented. The class dimension was subtler but equally present. The soda fountain was accessible in the sense that its prices were low enough to be within reach of a working-class budget, particularly for the modest purchases of a single drink or a small ice cream. But access in this formal sense coexisted with access in the social sense, which was more complicated. The soda fountain's culture, its unwritten rules, its codes of behaviour, its expectations about demeanour and dress, and the correct way to conduct oneself in a commercial social space, were the culture of a particular class of Americans, broadly the white urban and suburban working class and lower middle class, and deviation from those cultural expectations was noticed and sometimes discouraged. The person who arrived at the counter without the correct cultural fluency, the appropriate clothing, the right way of holding themselves, the right manner of placing an order, did not necessarily face explicit exclusion. The exclusion operated through more informal mechanisms, the slight pause before the order was taken, the subtly different quality of attention paid, the way the soda jerk's manner shifted from the easy familiarity offered to the regular to the slightly cooler professionalism offered to the unknown. These mechanisms did not prevent a determined person from having their drink. They shaped the quality of the experience in ways that made the fountain, for some people, a space where belonging had to be negotiated rather than assumed. The teenagers who sat on the red vinyl stools on Saturday afternoons and felt that the counter was theirs felt that way, partly because they were right. The counter had become theirs through the collective claiming of many Saturday afternoons, but also because they were the people for whom that particular claiming was socially available. The counter did not feel equally available to everyone. It never had. There is a specific and often overlooked dimension of the racial history of the soda fountain that goes beyond the documented exclusions of the segregated South. Northern cities in the 1940s and 1950s maintained racial segregation in commercial spaces through mechanisms that were less explicit than Jim Crow, but equally effective. Neighborhood geography, which was shaped by redlining and restrictive covenants, and the accumulated force of decades of discriminatory housing policy, meant that the soda fountain on Main Street of a given neighborhood was serving the demographic of that neighborhood, and the demographics of American urban neighborhoods in the mid-20th century were not the product of free choice. The black family that did not live in the neighborhood where the soda fountain was did not go to that soda fountain, not because of a posted sign, but because of a whole system of economic and social arrangements that made their presence in that neighborhood exceptional and their comfort in its commercial spaces conditional on a negotiation that white customers were not required to perform. The sit-in movement's choice of the lunch counter as the site of confrontation was therefore not arbitrary. The lunch counter and the soda fountain were symbols of a particular kind of American social life, casual commercial sociability, the ordinary daily pleasure of a cold drink in a pleasant setting that was presented in the official culture as universally available, as simply what Americans did, and that was in reality not universally available at all. The protesters at the Woolworths counter in Greensboro were demanding not merely service, but inclusion in the category of people for whom ordinary pleasures were ordinary. The violence with which they were sometimes met, the verbal abuse and the physical assault and the condiments poured over their heads by those who opposed their presence, was the violence of people defending an exclusion that they understood, at some level, to be indefensible, because you do not respond with that kind of force to a request that you genuinely believe is simply too unreasonable to consider. The history of the soda fountain's equipment tells a story of its own that is less dramatic but revealing in a different way. The great fountain equipment manufacturers, companies like Liquid Carbonic and the lemonade fountain specialists, and the dedicated soda fountain fixture firms, built their businesses on the assumption of a particular kind of market, one in which independent drugstore operators made capital investments in commercial kitchen equipment that would serve the store for a decade or two, and would be replaced by the next generation of equipment when it wore out or became obsolete. This business model depended on the continued existence of independent drugstores making independent capital investment decisions, and it was precisely this model that the drugstore chains destroyed efficiently and completely over the course of the 1950s and 1960s. The chains bought their equipment centrally, on contracts that favoured standardization over the individual choice of the independent operator, and they bought it from whoever offered the best price on a large order, which was not always the traditional soda fountain equipment companies. The companies that had built their businesses on the custom fixture trade, on the elaborate marble-topped counters and the individually specified equipment arrangements that each independent drugstore operator had ordered according to their own preferences and their own floor plan, found themselves confronting a market that no longer wanted what they had specialized in producing. Some of them adapted, shifting their production to the standardized equipment that the chains required. Others did not, and they are not remembered today. The craft of the elaborate soda fountain fixture, the panelled woodwork and the etched glass mirrors and the onyx tops that had made the fountain of the 1890s look like something worth travelling to, died along with the market for it, leaving behind only the surviving examples in museums and the photographs in trade publications that had documented the elaborate constructions of a trade's golden age. The Coca-Cola company's relationship with the soda fountain is a story of mutual dependence that ended, as such stories often do, with one party outgrowing the other. The fountain was the original distribution channel for Coca-Cola, the environment in which the syrup was mixed with carbonated water and presented to the customer, and for many years the fountain sale was the dominant mode of consumption. The bottling operation that Asa Candler developed in the 1890s was initially seen as supplementary to the fountain trade, a way to reach markets where no fountain existed, rather than a competitive alternative to the fountain experience. The bottled Coke changed the equation gradually, then rapidly, as refrigeration in the home became universal in the 1940s, and the convenience of the home refrigerator made the cold bottled drink a genuine competitor for the fountain drink, rather than merely an inferior substitute available in the absence of the real thing. The Coca-Cola company managed this transition with the commercial dexterity of an organization that had learned to survive the reformulation of its own product and had developed the institutional flexibility to manage its distribution channels as the market demanded. By the time the fountain trade was clearly declining, in the 1960s, The company had long since built the bottling and canning infrastructure that would sustain it in a world where the fountain was no longer the primary delivery system. For the soda fountain operators, this transition was less manageable. The fountain trade's economics, always precarious, became more so as the bottled and canned alternatives captured an increasing share of the cold drink market, and the competitive pressure from the growing fast food industry captured a growing share of the social function the fountain had performed. The operator, who had built a business on the assumption of being the most convenient and most pleasant way to consume a cold sweet drink in a social setting, found, in the course of a decade and a half, that the assumption no longer held. What happened to the equipment was unceremonious. The chrome was removed, the marble was sold, or in some cases simply demolished. The red vinyl stools were stacked in the back and eventually disposed of. The syrup pumps went to whatever buyer paid the price asked. The ice cream cabinets, still functional, found their way to other commercial uses. The glass and the stainless steel were cleaned and shipped out. The floor was refinished. The space became something else. In a small number of towns and cities, someone recognized the value of what was being dismantled before it was fully gone, and made the decision to preserve rather than discard. Some of these preserved fountains have operated continuously since their original installation. A few of them serve customers today who are old enough to remember sitting at a counter very like this one in 1963. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. And who return with the specific motivation of people who are not merely satisfying a taste but recovering a moment. The moment that sits at the intersection of the Saturday afternoon and the chocolate ice cream soda and the long gold light through the window and the particular way the stool felt when you climbed onto it and the day, finally, released you. Tonight we have spent our time inside a world that was sweet and cold and considerably more complicated than its image. We followed you to the counter on a Saturday afternoon in October of 1963, where the ice cream soda took 2 minutes and 45 seconds to make correctly, and lasted considerably longer to drink properly, and where the afternoon itself was the real product, and the soda was only the permission. We went back to the beginning of the thing, to the brass kettle in an Atlanta backyard and the marble fountains of the 1870s, and the slowly clarifying understanding that carbonated water mixed with syrup was not really medicine, but was something better, which was a reason for people to gather in a pleasant place and sit with each other for a while. We went behind the counter and learned the specific knowledge that lives in the hands of someone who has built 400 ice cream sodas and no longer thinks about any of the individual steps. And we looked at what the cheerful image left out, the racial exclusions written into the social geography of the counter, the labour that paid poorly and taught skills that transferred nowhere, the economics that were always precarious and became more so as the world changed faster than the fountain could follow. These things belong together, not because they cancel each other out, not because the complications of the institution make the pleasure of the afternoon any less real, but because both the pleasure and the complications were part of the same world, lived by the same people, in the same Tuesday and Saturday afternoons of the same ordinary lives. The teenager on the stool enjoying the chocolate ice cream soda, and the soda jerk behind the counter, earning 35 cents an hour, and the black teenager who was not permitted to sit at the counter at all, were all part of the same story, and the story is not told accurately if any of them is left out. The soda fountain understood something, however imperfectly and however unevenly it distributed that understanding, about the human need for a place that is neither work nor home, a place where the transaction is small enough to be genuinely available, and the social permission it purchases is generous enough to last an afternoon. A place where the making of something cold and sweet and given to you across a counter carries a weight of belonging that is entirely disproportionate to the ingredients involved. People have always needed that. The specific form it took in the American drugstore of the mid-20th century was the soda fountain, and the form was shaped by the economics and the social conventions and the racial architecture of its particular moment. And it was genuinely, specifically beautiful in the ways that things built for human comfort can be beautiful when they work, and genuinely, specifically limited in the ways that things built inside imperfect systems are always limited. The fountain is gone from most of the places it once occupied. The marble tops and the chrome dispensers and the red vinyl stools are in museums and antique shops, and the occasional deliberately preserved establishment that has understood that rarity is its own form of value. The teenagers who spent their Saturday afternoons at those counters in the 1950s and 1960s are in their 70s and 80s now, and the Saturday afternoons they remember feel, from the distance of that many years, like something from a world that operated under different rules, which in many respects it did. What persists is not the object but the quality of the experience, the specific pleasure of a place that belongs to you without requiring you to own it, the small ritual of a cold, sweet thing made by someone who has learned to make it well and hands it to you across a counter, the particular warmth of a room full of people who have nowhere pressing to be and have collectively decided that this is enough. These things did not disappear with the chrome dispensers. They went looking for somewhere else to live, and they found places imperfect and various, and not quite the same, but recognisable if you know what you're looking for. Rest now. Let the afternoon on the stool come back to you, the specific weight of it, the way the October light came through the window at a long gold angle, the sound of the radio not quite audible over the conversation, the straw rattling at the bottom of the glass at the end of something good. Let the soda jerk be young again and confident in his technique. Let the booth by the window be occupied by people who are working out who they are going to be, which is the only work available to them at this particular moment, and which is, despite appearances, genuinely serious work. Somewhere, in a room that smells of carbonated water and chocolate syrup and the particular clean lemony smell of a counter wiped down recently, a girl in a paper hat is building something cold and sweet with practiced hands, her feet aching in shoes she chose for how they looked rather than how they would feel at the end of a 7-hour shift. She has nowhere to be until the shift ends. She's doing the thing she's learned to do. The glass fills, the foam rises to just below the rim, the ice cream is lowered in, it is ready. And wherever you are, and whatever evening this is, there is a stool with your name on it, and the afternoon is still long, and the drink is exactly right. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.